Tough world, honest questions. It's the world that has very little time for promise keeping. The easiest thing in the world is to break your promise. If it suits you, if it's profitable, a lie is as good a way of accomplishing your ends as anything. Perhaps that's overstating the case, but again and again we find it to be true. Promises have little value. But the Lord Jesus laid a great emphasis on them. Let's read Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 37. As he had the crowd around him on that day, he went on to talk about adultery. You have heard, he said, that it was said, "Do not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks on at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a woman so divorced commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "Do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord." But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Well, Jesus touches on three issues here: adultery, divorce, and promises. And the promise element relates to all three. Look first of all about what Jesus says concerning adultery. We discover that sexual morality is God's purpose for us. And that's the essence of verses 27 to 30. Jesus refers to both adultery and divorce. Strictly speaking, adultery is immorality within a marriage relationship. And promises are vital here. As a couple are united in marriage, they take marriage vows. It includes remaining together for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish, protect and encourage, from this day forward until death us do part. Solemn promises, vows that are taken. The word adultery often seems to have a wider usage than strictly between married couples, and comes to equal immorality within or outside marriage. Immorality, that is sexual immorality, outside marriage is equally forbidden, as is immorality within marriage. And that's clear both in the Old Testament and in the New. And in a very brief sentence, Paul says to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 18, flee from sexual immorality. And that seems to sum it up. And therefore, when we look at divorce, we discover that it involves the breaking of marriage promises or vows. We won't deal with marriage and divorce as specific subjects here. Jesus deals more fully with both in chapter 19 of Matthew, verses 1 to 12. It's true that most people get married. And it's good to form biblical attitudes to marriage before one enters into that relationship. And they're very different from secular attitudes. 1 in 3 marriages that are enacted in this country today will end in divorce. It's an attitude that allows one to escape from an unprofitable, or seemingly so, unprofitable relationship. I remember when our boys were at school, the youngest came home one day and we were talking in the kitchen about marriage and divorce. It was a subject they'd discussed that day. And he came up with the idea, which had gained current acceptance, it appeared in his class. Well, why get so worked up about marriage? If it doesn't work out, you can easily get a divorce and start all over again. Seems so simple, but it wasn't. Quite recently, friends of ours were celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary. It was a great occasion. They invited a whole host of people to come along and celebrate with them. One of those who came was a girl about to be married. And she was thrilled about the dress she was going to have and the celebrations, the reception, the number of people that were going to be invited. And then she looked at our friends and said, 25 years. That's a lifetime. You know, we're really fond of each other, but I just can't think of how we could stick together for 25 years. To what extent are the social pressures rubbing off on us as we are affected by them? Sex before marriage today is regarded as the norm, not the exception. So, what should our attitudes be? Well, first of all, the Lord Jesus makes it clear in these verses that adultery is not on. There's verse 27. You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. One husband, one wife relationship till death is what the Bible is talking about. Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, the 7th commandment, underlines that, and it's that the Lord Jesus is quoting to his hearers. Do not commit adultery. And along with that, Jesus gets behind the law and says in verse 28, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So, not only is there to be no adultery, but Jesus adds, no lust. We can lust for all kinds of things. For money, for power, and for sex. And sexually, we experience it as a strong drive. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5, Paul says this, Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, and then at the very head of the list, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, things which are common, things which are to be dealt with. And Peter makes a similar point in his first letter, chapter 4, verse 3. You have spent enough time, he writes, in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust. And John, in his first letter, chapter 2, verse 15, verse 16, talks about the craving of sinful man, the lust of his eyes. And he says, steer clear of it. This lust involves coveting as well. In the Exodus passage, chapter 20, verse 17, you find these words, you shall not covet your neighbour's wife. That's where wrong desire starts. Wishing perhaps you have someone else. Coveting, lusting, and then the act. This wrong desire is detailed by the Lord Jesus when he speaks to the crowd, and you find it in Mark chapter 7, verse 21 and 22, 23. He says there, from within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. It's the evil thoughts, the lust, the coveting that lead to adultery, and the Lord Jesus made it clear. It's a slippery slope from which so often one finds great difficulty in turning back. And so radical action is called for, and Christ refers to that in verses 29 and 30. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away, cutting off your right hand, and similarly throwing it aside. What does Jesus mean? He doesn't seem to be talking literally about physical amputations, but he does mean deal with the situation. There in Colossians chapter 3 verse 5, Paul underlines the same point. Put to death, therefore, these evil thoughts. But he doesn't leave it solely with the negative. Surely the negative's important. But he goes on and calls for positive action. In that whole passage in Colossians chapter 3, you have verse 1, verse 2, verse 10, verse 12, verse 13, all of which have positive elements to concentrate on. So having put to death, put aside, turned our back on the evils of lust and adultery, Paul says, set your minds on things that are above, where Christ is. Set your hearts there. Put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge, in the image of its Creator. Verse 12, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness and patience. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Here are the positive elements that come together to help us live the kind of life the Lord Jesus wants us to live. Paul makes the same point in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, where we read those striking words, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. It's important that our minds concentrate on what is good and not on what is evil. But it's a continuing battle. Satan assaults. There are physical attractions in people. As a man, you may feel that she's wonderfully sympathetic. She's understanding. She's perhaps so much better than your wife. And that's the devil's lie. Enticing. He's to be resisted. Paul wrote to Timothy, a comparatively young person, in his second letter, chapter 2 and verse 22, where he said, "Flee from evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart." Do you get the double emphasis? He says on the one hand, flee from the evil desires of youth, but then the positive side, pursue righteousness, faith, love, and not alone. Something we find difficult to do on our own all the time. But he says, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. He told the Corinthians that bad company corrupts good morals. But the converse is also true, that good company strengthens good morals. Choose the company that you keep, and that helps. Think on the things which are pure, beautiful, lovely, right and true, along with others who have a similar commitment. But in this continuing battle, don't let's fool ourselves that it's only when we're young that these troubles can catch up with us. I remember a cousin in my own family who, when he was well over 60, fell for another woman, went off and left his wife, and there was a broken marriage. Take positive action. Look at divorce. Divorce isn't a first or easy option. The Lord Jesus mentions it here, having dealt with adultery. And he says in verse 31, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But then he says that if a divorce is given for any other reason than marital unfaithfulness, he not only causes her to commit adultery, but also anyone who marries her. A divorce is an enormous subject, particularly today. God sets high standards. That's what we have to remember. In Jesus' day, there were two schools of thought concerning adultery and divorce. There was the school of Shammai, who said that divorce was for adultery only, nothing else would be acceptable. And there was Hillel, who said that adultery was not the only factor by any means, but divorce could be obtained for anything offensive, from adultery to burning one's husband's food, or to seeing someone more beautiful than your wife. The Lord Jesus makes his position plain. Divorce is permissible on the grounds of adultery, but not desirable. Reconciliation is by far the better course of action if it's at all possible. The better way. Both sides keeping marriage promises. Divorce can be avoided. Paul writes in Colossians 3, verse 13 and 14, bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. And that applies particularly to a marriage relationship. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. He didn't go in for a divorce so far as we were concerned. Over all these virtues, says Paul, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Divorce isn't a first or easy option when a marriage seems to go wrong. The last comment the Lord Jesus makes concerns promises. Commit yourself to your promises, he says in verse 33 to 37. Be wholehearted in your personal commitment. There's nothing to be gained from involving external factors like heaven or earth or even the hairs on your head. He said, make your promise stick with that personal commitment of your yes being yes and your no, no. You can't pass the buck to heaven and say, heaven, let me down. I made my promise in the name of heaven or God or whoever. But we're personally responsible for keeping our promises. And remember, we make our promises not just to one another, but to God himself. There in verse 33, Jesus says, do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord. This applies very particularly to a marriage relationship, that those vows, those promises are made in his presence to each other and to the Lord himself. And we're assured of God's help if we really wholly commit ourselves to keeping our promises. Paul has a striking reference in Philippians chapter 2 verse 13 where he says, it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his purpose. And as you feel God prompting you to keep your promise in your everyday life, in a marriage relationship or outside it, you know that God's on your side to give you all the help that you need to fulfill that promise. Marriage breakdown is one of the greatest sociological problems of today that all of us face, and along with it the resulting one-parent children with which our society abounds. God and the Lord Jesus Christ give us the answer. Adultery, divorce, they're not on. But the fulfillment of a promise and a commitment is what God requires, and he gives us the strength to go through with it if we look to him.